Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Ethnography, State and the Colonial Episteme, which is part of the Political Sociology paper. How do we understand the colonial rule in India? How did the British rule over such a huge country and such a huge population without always the use of power, that is, without the use of force? The central argument in this module is that they constructed an episteme of superiority of the West versus the East, and through this idea of Western superiority, they could rule over the Indian natives. This module will therefore look at how this episteme is constructed and what are the various sides at which this ideology of superiority gets naturalized by the natives. Ethnography, State and the Colonial Episteme. Anthropology and the Colonial Episteme. As a discipline, anthropology emerged out of the European colonial expansion in the non-Western world. Borrowing from the methods of natural sciences, European scholars of the 19th century believed that they could similarly study the natives and their life worlds in an objective manner. This methodology of comprehending and representing the primitive ways of life was undertaken from the high ground of the civilized West. In this exercise, quite clearly, as Talal Asad has argued, many of the anthropologists became enmeshed with the larger project of colonial domination. Not surprisingly then, anthropology as a discipline became engaged in the project of constructing a colonial episteme which functioned as a discourse of domination and subjugation all across the non-European world. How does one characterize this colonial episteme? How does one represent the complex and dynamic ways in which the colonial episteme came to embody very contradictory claims of both domination and progress? It may be noted here that from the very beginning it was ethnography and its techniques of data collection that functioned as the basis for an anthropological study of non-Western societies. This method employs a range of techniques to document and classify exotic life worlds such as participant observation, anthropometry, physical and morphological measurements, case studies, field studies, etc. It follows then these ethnographic techniques provided the colonial rulers with a strategy of making sense of the social customs and practices of the natives. In this connection, the myth of the civilizing mission as construed by the imperial West served as a useful legitimation to represent this entire knowledge through a Eurocentric lens. It is this Eurocentric gaze, as recorded by colonial administrators, scholars and missionaries, which form the core of the colonial episteme. In its representation, the colonial episteme took the form of binaries as in the West and the East, the I and the other. The other quite clearly signified the native subjects as exotic, pre-modern, uncivilized, eccentric, backward, sensual, despotic and lazy, also immoral, passive, religious and spiritual. Clearly then, the Orient was constructed by the West as a mirror image of the other, seen as what is inferior, alien and uncivilized to the West, which saw itself as a superior civilization. Within the larger project of imperial domination, these asymmetrical knowledge constructions soon became a source of power, a modus operandi through which the British were able to rule Indian subcontinent for more than 2 centuries. Yet, it is important to know that even as the colonial episteme functioned as an ideological regime to legitimize the continued domination of the native people, it sought to justify the knowledge of anthropology by resorting to the principles of strict scientific investigation. With its emphasis on empirical observation, measurement, enumeration and classification, the science of anthropology came to be intricately entwined with the agendas of colonial domination. Not surprising then, in many parts of the colonial world, especially in Africa, anthropologists also served as administrators within the colonial government. Further, this ethnographic project involved many of the colonial institutions engaged with administrative, military and judicial functions. Several institutions like the Anthropological Society of London, the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland, the Anthropological Survey of India, the Asiatic Society of India, the Census of India, among others, were hugely involved in collecting and documenting information of the diverse native cultures. Military officers, civil servants and members of the clergy were trained in collecting ethnographic details. As far back as the 1820s, the East India Company had sought the services of Herbert Risley to conduct an ethnographic survey of the tribes and castes of the Bengal Presidency. Similar such ethnographic surveys were produced for the colonial state in other parts of India. A quick survey of the ethnographic records clearly reveals the emphasis on types and classifications, thereby providing the colonial administration with a much more comprehensive understanding of the native population and the diverse cultures. In addition, such trained ethnographers, many of whom also came from the native population, also published in reputed scientific journals such as Anthropological Magazine and Man. Such publications only further legitimize the biological and cultural backwardness of the natives. It is little wonder, therefore, that anthropology is today viewed as a colonial construct that legitimized colonial state policies and its project of ideological rule over the native population. Across the colonial regions of Africa and Asia, colonial anthropology functioned in more or less the same manner, that is, becoming the knowledge support for the practitioners of colonial governance. In the next section, we shall look at the sites of practice in which anthropology and ethnographic method were consistently deployed to maintain and reproduce the structures of colonial domination. Consolidation of colonial rule in India. By the 1830s, with absolute military domination of India, the East India Company, with instructions from the British Parliament in England, began consolidating its administrative and political control over a unified subcontinental region. It is no wonder then, post 1857, the colonial state began to introduce diverse systems of enumeration that would have far-reaching consequences on the practice of colonial rule and the structure of imperial domination in the subcontinent. For the British, this was a gigantic task, and it entailed developing both administrative conformity as well as ideological compliance from the native population. Thus, for example, the famous Macaulay Minutes of 1835 made it clear that the colonialists wanted to create a small section of indigenous elites who would be British-like in taste, opinions, morals, but Indian in color. It was hoped that this section of indigenous elites would then operate as the intermediaries between the colonial rulers and the indigenous population. This entailed the establishment of a new education system together with several new institutions in civic and political life that could become the formative ground on which this new class of indigenous elites would come to acquire not only a new learning and a new set of skills, but also in the process become the interpreters and trusted citizens of the colonial state. With this objective, the colonial state from the mid-19th century onwards began to organize new institutions such as education, judiciary, police, military, recruitment of indigenous subjects, civil service, lower level bureaucracy, lower level revenue departments, and also promoted organization of civic organizations that would operate as civil societies at the behest of the colonial regime. For entry and maneuvering in these fields, the colonial state made it mandatory that the indigenous subjects had to possess certain kinds of cultural, social and symbolic capital such as educational degrees, rudimentary level of literacy in English, noble family social backgrounds, and recommendations from recognized indigenous actors, among other such criteria. Such practices as enforced by the colonial rulers ensured that native subjects were henceforth to be recognized through their community membership rather than as individuals. There were many such institutional sites in which community membership took precedence over individual, as we shall be considering some of these. What is important to note here is that once again such a knowledge construction creates another binary between individual and community. It is these binaries with asymmetrical relationships that serve as the basis to legitimize the knowledge power relationship of one over the other. Sites of enumeration and classification. In 1861, the colonial administration began to undertake census operation, and these had far-reaching consequences on the way in which members of the native population came to identify and represent themselves. The census enumerated the native population using a variety of social categories, which themselves were the sites of considerable contestation amongst the native population. Categories such as tribe, caste, religion, and even race became the markers for recognizing individuals as members of one group or another. Many caste associations and religious groups petitioned the colonial authorities, contesting the way in which these markers had identified, represented, and classified them within the census. Similarly, census officials found it extremely difficult to put in place the system of classification that could neatly categorize various sections of the Indian population. Another such exercise in enumeration and classification were undertaken by the Anthropological Survey of India. Here again, enumeration was carried out using the practice of anthropometry. In particular, such anthropometric classification was extensively used to enumerate section of the tribal population in different parts of the country. Such an exercise culminated in the practice of labeling. Some communities which lived on the peripheries of the caste and tribe societies, and some which were displaced tribal communities, were labeled as Thuggees. The Thuggees were supposedly those communities whose occupation was thievery and looting. Members of these communities faced constant surveillance from the colonial state and were also subjected to police harassment. Thus, the British invented a new category called criminal tribes, in which these communities, together with many of the nomadic and not so easily classifiable communities, were henceforth placed under the restriction of an act by the colonial state. This act entailed that henceforth the movement of the communities was to be constantly monitored, and that they were to be treated as unwanted subjects of the colonial state. Enumeration and classification were also adopted by the military and the police within the colonial state. The British Army could not fight its war of colonization on territories in Africa and Middle East with other European nations on its own. It had to enlarge its army to include natives, as these soldiers were dispensable. After the Indian Revolt of 1857, the Peel Commission in 1858-59 made the general recommendation on recruitment that a native army should be raised that should be composed of different nationalities and castes, mixed promiscuously through each regiment as the best safeguard against revolt. It was in this context that the colonial state introduced the concept of martial race in the last decade of the 19th century. Soldiers were explicitly drawn from the so-called martial castes. But the question that emerged during this time was how to identify members of this caste who would be pure or so-called asal. In this context, the ethnographic profiles of these so-called martial castes were collated into an Indian Army handbook. This handbook had detailed ethnographic data, including physical anthropometric standards spelled out. This document also included details of the festivals, customs, habits, marriage practices, belief systems, religion, among other such facets. Based on these, the colonial state structured and raised various regiments. It is important to note that these regiments, both within the military and the police, played a crucial role in ensuring the continued domination of British imperial power over the native Indian population. So skillfully and efficiently were these security forces trained and organized that their services were continued without much change in the period after independence. While undertaking the laborious task of cataloguing the Indian population, the colonial state simultaneously expanded its presence through legal infrastructure. After the revolt of 1857, it realized that it was mandatory to put in place certain laws meant only for the natives that did not apply to the white man. New legal codes in the form of civil and criminal acts were introduced that ensured that the British rule could continue without losing out on its legitimacy of pariah of civilization. The laws that were to govern the natives were far detached from the life worlds and were versions of what the native scribal class interpreted for the British. Through the legal system, the colonial state created another avenue of manipulating the private sphere. The legal infrastructure was hierarchical in nature and was meant to instill fear of law in the minds of the natives. As law codes were based on Brahminical interpretations, there emerged various injunctions which were specific regarding various castes, tribes, gender, professions, among others. The new legal system in place circumscribed an official language for its functioning. These were Persian and English, both detached from the life worlds of the people who were governed. Also, this system could only be afforded by the few privileged native rajas, landlords, and the kind. With the colonial state now recognizing individuals through their communitarian identity, that is caste, religion, race, language, and region, this practice was soon resonated in all the colonial policies. In land-related policies, the colonial state decided to reorganize the existing land tenurial practice such that it did not completely rupture the traditional structure but instead introduced a system that recognized caste and varna system. A new practice called the Rayatwari system was introduced in addition to the existing Zamindari and Mahalwari land revenue system. In this system, the Rayat or the small landholder had to pay taxes to the colonial state directly rather than through an intermediary like the Zamindar. New cropping patterns and food regimes were introduced such that the colonial state accrued more and more profits. These new practices ruptured the erstwhile Balutedari system that was being practiced for centuries. The most affected in this exercise were the artisan caste and classes, as their services were no longer required. Some of these communities had to work as indentured labor in other British colonies such as Mauritius, British Guiana, Trinidad, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Lucia, Natal, St. Kitts, St. Vincent, Reunion, Suriname, Fiji, East Africa, and Seychelles to work on sugarcane, tea, spices, and rubber plantations. Other than just codification of societal information, colonial rule also entailed documentation of territorial and land-related practices. This exercise involved mapping of territory through cartography, documenting cropping patterns, land use patterns, creation of land registers, documents, manuals, official glossaries related to land use and tenurial practices, and the requisite translation of native vocabulary and grammar. This classification manifested itself into the construction of a simplistic binary map. The agrarian society was classified as caste society, and the inhabitants of forest, isolated and remote geographical areas were typified as being tribal. There was a clear and discrete disjunction between the two. In this framework, the tribals were supposedly primitive and beyond the colonial project of civilizing the natives. According to this plan, the tribal land, forests, and other areas were to be acquired by the colonial authorities such that these could be exploited to maximize profit. The forest areas were henceforth to be barricaded and made unauthorized for the natives. Instead, they were now reserved, and not only for the sole exploitation of forest and mineral resources by the colonial state, Similarly, introduction of exotic varieties of flora and fauna was undertaken. Plantations such as tea and coffee together with spices became significant for the colonial state. Gradually, as the forest lands were being cleared for further commercial agricultural use, the tribals who were the original inhabitants of these territories were displaced in large numbers. New laws and legislation were passed together with military and police action in these territories with the object of legitimizing colonial rule. What is important to note is that with the expulsion of the forest dwellers, over time the community also lost the language as they became dispersed. With loss of script and language, much of the traditional wisdom, art form and knowledge were lost. For instance, ethnomedicine and traditional forms of medical practices and science was lost in this exercise. The symbiotic relation between forest dwellers and the ecosystem of the forest was lost forever. Many of these communities had an inherent understanding of the ecosystem and their religious beliefs revolved around them. However, animism and anamitism was deemed to be primitive belief systems by the British and the missionaries who accompanied them. What is also interesting is the notion that the colonial anthropologist, together with his administrative counterpart, were keen to depict the forest dwelling communities as always isolated and who never came in contact with caste or agrarian society. In fact, a later day anthropology critiqued this simplistic binary, pointing to the close relationship that existed between tribes and caste from ancient times. Ethnographic representation and colonial ideology. In its endeavor to visualize Indian society in terms of its European counterpart, the colonial state, with the aid of native scholarship, predominantly the members of the Brahmin caste, constructed a knowledge system in which the Varna model of caste came to be recognized and legitimized. All castes and subcastes were ranked into fourfold classification. The notion that caste was a pan-Indian phenomena, a system based on purity and pollution, that is Varna system, was now subtly imbricated in the discourse of the colonial state. In the making caste an immanent, static and social and political entity, the census and other such ethnographic representations clearly open up spaces for caste contestations. In doing so, this contestation reaffirmed the idea of an omnipresent Brahminical model as the way in which Indian society was ordered. Equally interesting is the way in which the dominant and totalizing knowledge system was instituted in colonial India, and that prevails even to date. The colonial practices of domination through knowledge or power access ensured the naturalization of the idea of a uniform. The colonial practice of domination through knowledge power access ensured the naturalization of the idea of a uniform, all-encompassing, ideologically consistent and conceived caste system as the underlying keystone of understanding India. It is through these mechanisms of representation that groups were construed as communities, tribes and castes. In due course of time, tribes, communities and caste, that is the colonial way of understanding them, was frozen in time and came to be connoted as the colonial state imagined it to be. Thus, the colonial state in India ruled over the natives not only through overt military prowess but also through covert ideological domination. It was the latter method that proved to be much more profound and immanent in facilitating its rule. Thus, the colonial practices of domination through ideology, that is, knowledge power access, structured an understanding of Indian society so as to suggest that it was timeless, static, rigid, uniform, all-encompassing and ideologically consistent. This framework was convenient for colonial governmentality, as it was internalized over time by the natives who came to recognize themselves through this understanding. However, such transformation at the level of identity and categorization proved to be deeply problematic. In pre-colonial India, the units of social identity had been multiple, and the interfacing and interstices were complex, dynamic and flexible. Their referents of social identity were not only heterogeneous, they were also determined by context. However, with the inauguration of colonial rule, the opportunities and the potential for individuals and social groups to transcend their social position in the ranked classification decreased. Further, in the pre-colonial era, individuals and groups could capture power through military prowess and through control of the state, thereby ensuring economic and social mobility. With colonial rule, this proved to be impossible, as the British had successfully separated the social and the political into two exclusive domains. The political domain was now dictated by the colonial state. The only channel of social and economic mobility was streamlined through the access to the colonial structure, and this was only possible when native subjects operated through the identities given by the binary model of colonial state. Thus, in this module we have seen how this colonial episteme became an immanent knowledge system. It was through this episteme that caste as an identity became an immanent, static, timeless feature of Indian society. We have also seen how pre-modern identities such as religion, caste, tribe and other such forms became part and parcel of the understanding of the East and especially of India. This East versus the West, or the I and the other, and especially the othering of the natives, became a system, became a practice through which the West could easily rule over India. Thank you.